FTP, or functional threshold power, has arguably been the gold standard for cycling performance. But does it still live up to the hype? We cyclists have long been using it to guide our training, track our fitness, and let's be honest, compare ourselves to other riders. Yet World Tour coaches are abandoning it, pro cyclists no longer pay too much attention to it, and when you use the various testing methods for it, the results leave a lot of room for interpretation, potentially ignoring the variation between individuals' strengths and weaknesses.
So we do a 20-minute test, which is what most people would, do as a critical power test, but we don't do like a 95% calculation from that to then derive an FTP and use that in any way.
FTP is a predictor of a common type of race, but it's also overestimated in my opinion. It frustrates me a bit that coaches and athletes look to it as this holy grail that's going to tell you everything about your performance.
FTP, or functional threshold power, is the maximum power that you can hold in watts for an entire hour in its truest form. It's used in cycling to track your fitness and set training zones. But there are plenty of other ways that you can estimate your FTP without riding for that full hour. Recently, I did an FTP test every single day for an entire week, and by the end of it, my FTP was 403 watts. Today, I've input that number into my Kick and Move smart trainer, and I'm going to attempt to hold it for as long as possible and see if I can really hold it for a whole hour. There are plenty of ways to test for your FTP. Ride 20 minutes flat out, then divide your power average by 95%. Perform a ramp test where power increases until you can no longer pedal, then divide your final full power interval by a percentage. Take estimates from interval durations on longer, harder rides or races, or take on the grade climb in Zwift. Simply ride the climb hard as you can and Zwift will estimate your FTP for you. Which is what I did recently to get an estimate of mine. But that's the issue, it's an estimate. And I want to try and hold my 403 watt test result for a full hour to see if it actually matches up with what it should. And if it doesn't, is FTP really a concept worth paying attention to? Pretty nervous, because an hour is a long time, and genuinely I'm not entirely sure if I can do it. I think I can. I've said that before on the channel. Hasn't panned out well. Cy thinks I can do 26 minutes. That's his kind of his estimate. So as long as I beat that, I'll be happy. Time to stop procrastinating. Let's jump on the bike and do this. An hour is a long time. As I crack on with my hour of power, it's worth asking, where did FTP come from and why do we all use it? FTP became a popular term in the early 2000s, just as power meters started to become cheaper and more widely used. Before this point, it was heart rate or perceived exertion that you had to rely on. Once watts became a thing, training changed forever. There were many theories about how best to use power data, and Dr. Andrew Coggan developed power-based training around FTP. I actually remember reading his books and basing my own training from his methods. But that was a while ago now. Are pros and coaches these days still using it to guide training? To find out, I chatted with coach at Tudor Pro Cycling, James Spragg, to get his thoughts. I mean, the power you can sustain for an hour, it's always been linked to FTP. Is FTP, functional threshold power, something you test with riders? Is it something you consider when you're working towards specific goals or on the team?
No, to be honest. So for the last, essentially since I went into academia and did my master's PhD, I've always used critical power in all the calculations we have. With critical power, you get two parameters. So you get critical power and you get this W prime parameter. And with two parameters, you can explain more performance than with one parameter. That's, quite kind of logical. So we do a 20-minute test. But that 20-minute test is part of a battery of tests, which give us kind of the whole power profile from an athlete. So all the way from 1 second, all the way down to what that first threshold is. And we measure at various points, or, take maximal powers at various points. And then we can, in testing, and we can compare them back to races and things like that. So we do a 20-minute test, which is what most people would, do as a critical power test. But we don't do like a 95% calculation from that to then derive an FTP and use that in any way. It's just one of many tests that we use to create that power profile on our athletes.
And how, just talking about those differences between riders, like how much variance do you see between riders in terms of like what they can sustain for one duration compared to another? Like how much does that change between good like professional cyclists?
Massively, so we have some riders, like let's take, like at the first threshold, we have some riders that might be at 90%. Their first threshold is 90% of what they can sustain, or their critical power, which is kind of a similar sort of metric. It's sustainable for maybe 40-45 minutes for professional athletes. We might have some that are down at 70%. If they're very new coming into the team, they haven't got much of a training background. Likewise, 3-minute powers to 20-minute powers, we see massive variation in, might be from 130% down to 110%, something like that. So you see riders produce powers in very different ways, and there's not really a best way to do it. It's more designed around what their role is in races, etc. If you want classics, you might want to be a bit punchier, for example, if that's your role, especially in a lead-out train, something like this, where you need to produce those short kind of intense bursts of power. If you're a pure climbing domestique, for example, and you need to sit on the front for 3 coals before your leader attacks on the last one, then obviously you need those longer durations to be really sustainable and close to what you can sustain for an hour. So it's all about taking that power profile, not just one number, if that makes sense, looking at the complete range of durations, picking out strengths and weaknesses that normally aligns with roles, especially at professional cycling, level, and then thinking about, okay, what do we potentially want to move? What do we potentially want to work on? And then working on that in training to try and have that filter through in terms of performance on the bike.
Well, I'm essentially taking myself right to my aerobic limit. So I'm going to be heavy breathing the whole way through. And it hurts a bit, but just have to kind of settle in, find your pace. Heart rate's starting to stabilise already, around 143. So it'll gradually rise. But for now, in control, ticking on. Would like to play some music though, but I'm not allowed. I'm still hanging in there, but the pace is starting to hurt. And whilst I cook up in the pain chamber, I thought it'd be worth getting another take on FTP. So I got in touch with Colby Pearce, 14-time US national champ, previous US hour record holder, and now coach with Team EF Coaching.
FTP is a predictor of a common type of race, but it's also overestimated in my opinion. It frustrates me a bit that coaches and athletes look to it as this holy grail that's going to tell you everything about your performance. It's important, yes. It's a predictor, yes. But there are many things that can predict an athlete's performance, right? And there are also many things, like that old saying, like, this won't win you the race, but it can lose the race for you. Like, you can have a super high FTP, and then if you can't go around a corner, guess what? You're not going to be a very good bike racer, most likely, unless you only sign up for hill climbs. You can have a massive FTP, but be as aerodynamic as like a sideways Frisbee or a brick, and you're not going to go very fast in a lot of bike races, right? I do try to educate my riders about the relationship between really fundamentally FTP, which is more on the side of aerobic metabolism versus glycolytic metabolism. And I try to sort of illustrate that in most cases that those two numbers sort of are reciprocal to each other. As one goes up, the other will go down. I think that's really important for them to understand as a concept. And then further, I try to educate them on what types of training will sort of put them more towards, upregulating one or spinning up one or spinning down the other. And then we can discuss, what type of event they're training for and how they want to train. So I try to give them a landscape. But as far as the practical application of training, I sort of split the difference, I would say. I use FTP as it's like a waypoint, you might say, or a buoy. And it's useful, but really I prefer not to coach my athletes in terms of going out and giving them a power target or a power range. And I don't think this is a popular way to coach right now. I think the majority of coaches, from what I've seen, and the majority of athletes, are looking at a power meter as a tool where it tells you what to do. And it's like the the man in the sky or the authority figure. It's like, you're good, you're bad. It's a very childlike perspective, actually. It's like, okay, today you were supposed to make this many watts for this many minutes, and you either did or you didn't. And if you didn't, you're a bad boy or girl. And if you did, you get gold stars. And I really want my athletes to have a better understanding of what they're doing. I also think that power is a metric that feeds something more important. So power to me is output, right? It's objective output. And then we have another data point, which is heart rate, which is our central nervous system response to global load. And people don't like that definition much, because global doesn't just mean what's happening on the bike. It also means everything else in your life. Hydration, stress, how much sleep you got, etc. And then the third point is really the most important in this triangle. We have power, heart rate, and perceived exertion. And perceived exertion is actually where it's at, in my opinion. It's the center of the universe. Power and heart rate are there to help us inform perceived exertion.
Okay, so I'm about 9 minutes in now. Settled into my rhythm, actually. Just kind of found my groove. Heart rate is like 161, 162, all under control, holding the power. Obviously, when I talk, you can hear that I'm a bit on the edge. So I do have to focus on my breathing. But I like this kind of effort. When I was racing, this is the sort of duration I felt I was well suited to. I liked to get in there, break away, ride hard off the front, set it into like one pace and sustain that. There's actually really short, sharp accelerations where I became unstuck in the bunch. And even though I'm not training as hard these days, I do still like this kind of effort. So I'll be interested to see like how the legs hold up to it now. As you can see, it's starting to bite though.
I'm on the ropes, but just about hanging in there on pace. But it is beginning to really hurt. 20 minutes in and there is still a long way to go. And it has been a long time since I tried to hold over 400 watts for an hour. Despite its flaws we've already mentioned, I always used FTP in my training and found it beneficial, and plenty of other people do too. So is there still some use in knowing it as a number? I caught up with three-time Olympian and now coach Oli Beckingsale to get his thoughts.
And you coach a wide range of riders.
Yeah.
Do you use FTP with them, and why is it useful?
It gives a repeatable number, it gives a number to chase. So if we separate the kind of racers from the, so you've got your guys who compete and guys who look to complete. That's the kind of two. Guys who look to complete, it gives them a really relevant number that they can establish using a fitness test that they can do at home. They're not going to have a lab. Even if they did have a lab to do one test, they can't repeat that the week after. So in terms of gas and air analysis, lactate measurements, they're not going to be able to do that month in, month out. So it's something they can do on a trainer at home or on a local road, give them a threshold power, which then we can work out some training zones on. It's not perfect, it's rough, but it's good enough. And if I go back to when I was starting off training and getting into it, it was a heart rate monitor and 220 minus my age. So things have moved on and things will continue to move on. But right now, for most guys, I think it's really important.
And I guess FTP is become kind of like the metric to use over the last couple of decades. Do you think it's deserving of that sort of title?
Yeah, and I think if you're looking, whether it's Zwift, Training Peaks, Wahoo, all the big guys, they want to have something that they can design a product around. So I think FTP works really well for those guys. But then I think it's convenient for those guys, but I think it's also convenient for all the consumers. They can establish a number. If I looked at some of my athletes, they start training, we do a baseline test, it might be 200 watts. We can then establish some zones very quickly using one of the systems, some of the tools they can jump on. Let's say Zwift, for example, the sessions they can go, well, actually, I now know what power is. I know that this session's working on that one. At the moment, that FTP, for myself, I use it, and if I think of some of my athletes last week, we had 6 riders. We wanted to do a bit of a pre-season test and a bit of a tear-up. We all raced up out to Zwift. Great session. 4 guys had an increased FTP from it. Whether they've increased their zone 2, their zone 7, but actually they all left there knowing that their training zones were pretty accurate going forward, but also really motivated. And one of the guys underperformed a bit, and that gave him motivation that in the next month he needs to probably crack on. But it was really easy to do. We all did it in our garages. We've all got some more accurate zones and powers to work with. So I think there's nothing not to love about that.
Back to my effort, and I'm really up against it. As you can tell from some of the noises I'm beginning to make. There is a reason people have always found ways to avoid hour-long tests.
I'm in a bad way. Pedal stroke. Back pedal stroke. I think this might be it. Oh, my days. Oh. That's so hard. I forgot how hard that effort is when you just go to exhaustion. I was like holding it. Kind of once I got past the 20-minute mark, I could just feel I was struggling to keep my heart rate down. It was like ticking up bit by bit. I just couldn't recover in the effort. But yeah, couldn't hold it for the hour. Couldn't do it. So, I think I need to catch my breath, get a shower, and then go through the data properly.
Looking through the numbers, I managed to hold my estimated FTP of 403 watts for 26.5 minutes. If you look at a chart of my power and heart rate, it's visible how my heart rate never really manages to properly stabilise. It's rising gradually throughout, maxing at 175 beats per minute. I've gone to the brink, but it wasn't enough.
One last question, because I managed to hold my estimated FTP for 26.5 minutes. So, would that be something you'd expect? I was a bit off the kind of the golden hour standard as it was. What does that kind of tell you, do you think?
It probably tells me that more than 5% of the energy, if that makes sense, the power output was coming from, let's call them anaerobic. It's not quite correct because it's always a bit of a mix of energy sources, but unsustainable kind of energy pathways, if that makes sense. So for you, that 95% clearly doesn't work as a predictor of 1 hour power from the 20-minute. You might need a 92 or a 91%, for example. And that comes back to my first point about the arbitrary 95%. Okay, it's a little bit like the 220 minus your age of heart rate. It might work at a population level, but at an individual level, which is ultimately what we're interested in, because we're coaching individuals are riding in races, etc. It's just not probably accurate enough to be able to then prescribe training or to be able to make any guesses about how an athlete might perform in a race.
So I didn't make it. Just under half an hour short of managing to hold that estimated FTP number. But what do I think about FTP after this experiment? Well, I think I'm still reassured that FTP is a valuable tool for most cyclists. It gives you a really good idea of your form and also provides you with some good information to set training zones and know what intensity you should be riding at. And it's something that most of us can understand when it comes to this. But at the same time, it is really important to remember the caveats, as mentioned by most of the coaches we spoke to in this video. And it's not a holy grail. It's not one single number that you can rely on and it will tell you everything about your form on the bike. And that's highlighted even more in the pro ranks. Just look at how many different ways that James is testing his riders at the team that he works with. As Colby reminded me, it's not just about how many watts you can put down, but it's about how fast you can ride your bike at the end of the day. And that's the most important thing if your aim is to ride your bike as fast as possible. But let me know in the comment section down below. Have you used FTP when you're training your bike? Have you stopped using it? Have you used something else entirely now? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and I really hope you found this video useful too. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.